Hey, how's it going, guys? Today I'm going to be doing a system tray tutorial, and it's not just a simple tray. There's a bit of additional things I've included here so that you could do everything that you need to do except for one thing, which is the on-demand translations. So if you want to see an on-demand translation tray, my app in Python has that, but obviously to do that in Tauri is going to be a bit difficult. So I'm not going to be doing that just for free just yet. I'll do it if I ever need to, which is like in maybe 4 months. But right now it's pretty good. So over here we have this. So the front end can get events as well if you want to send the events to the front end. And right now I have a notification for that. You can toggle the icon. I have that feature here too. You can do other things like on the backend side, you can, as you can see, you can change the label as well, and you can what I have provided, and you can edit the window stuff as well with in the backend. There's this separator here if you need it. Not really sure if you need it though, and you can obviously do that. Quit. So let's just get started. The first thing is that let's start with the icon, right? So you want to figure out what icon you want to have by default, and once you have an idea, you want to basically put like the PNGs in here in this folder called icons. You also want to just quickly ignore the icon system tray directory. So I just noticed that there's also a git ignore in the source Tauri folder. So what you want to do is add something called icons and system tray star. And once you have the PNG that you want to use or PNGs that you want to use, you need to create an ICO, because if you were to just use the PNG, something would go wrong. So to create the ICO, you can follow my README instructions in the sample README or whatever, or the README for your folder, and you just copy this and you say Tauri icon, okay, source the image, and then output to that directory. Now, when we run this command, it'll create a folder with all those icons, and it won't actually add it to the git status over here. So you won't have to delete the folder afterwards. And afterwards, you open the folder and you see icon.ico, you rename this to system tray1.ico and you move it back up here. So you do that for all your icons. And I suggest keeping the original sources as well, because you never know what'll occur in the future. But it is, yeah, exactly. You won't know what'll happen in the future because how did you get this icon in the first place, right? So after that, you just do system tray icon path icon as template. So this is a Mac OS feature. So I don't really know much about it, but since the default was true in the documentation, you should keep it true. Okay, now we can actually get to the Rust part. So now in your cargo.toml file, you want to ensure that you have icon.ico. So I had to add this part. And you also want to ensure that system tray is a feature here. I'm not sure if system tray, for me, for some reason, system tray was already here, which is probably because of the configuration file, but it's possible that it's not there. So just ensure that the icon.ico feature is enabled or added there, and now we can actually start programming. So I am going to close the terminal so that you guys can see a bit better. We're going to start with the front end, the back end, because that's kind of where most of the work is being done, and I will zoom in for you guys because I know this is going to be tough. So what I've done is I've aggregated all of the imports that are straight out of Tauri, and most of them are for the system tray. So you want to use all of these imports, and then we can keep going on. So the first thing that we can do, because this is just my code, is we can just see what I did, right? So a couple things I did is I wanted to be able to send this event to the front end, and I also want to be able to toggle the icon. And to do that, we need a payload struct. So I've added a system tray payload. This is similar to my Python code over here that I use to send events from my tray to the other thread. So there's actually two processes for my music player. So if you go to my system, if you see my system tray over here, and don't comment on how messy, or actually it's not that messy, but as you can see, it's kind of similar in the, it's not similar at all, but let's ignore that. But anyways, what I do here is I use queues between processes, and I only put in the key or the string. So it operates the same way. That's how I know how to use things. Is that if I want to communicate with the front end or send things to the front end, I'll use a message. So that's kind of the logic that I did here. I just looked at my music player and I did it like that. But if you want to tell the tray to update from the front end, you probably want to have some custom commands that you'll create. So something like show main window. So that's what you do like custom commands for. If you see over here, I have those commands here, like they're extremely, okay, they're actually pretty simple here, but you know, it could be a bit more complicated than that. Like over here, it says if tray has notification, right? So for things like nested conditionals, you'd probably want to take care of that in the command itself. But anyways, let's create those structs and an enum. So I use a struct for the payload because obviously you want to send that payload, but for the trace state, I use an enum or enum. I'm not even sure how to do it, but I just replicated how my music player works, which is it's in a pause, playing, and not playing state. It's actually just a filled and unfilled state, but you could do something like tray icon. Okay, so if you want to manage the tray icon, you could do this and then filled and unfilled. Okay. So if the tray icon is filled or unfilled, so these are like types of icons, right? So for a filled icon and an unfilled icon, that's what I did. But usually the icon depends on a certain state, not necessarily what's that called? Not necessarily the icon, right? You're not changing the icon based on the icon. You're changing the icon based on a state. So that's why I have it like this. You could probably just use app state, not really trace state. It really depends on the logic of your app. So if I was building a music pair, I'd probably say something like trace state as well. Okay, yeah, I would keep it as trace state just because it's simple for what it communicates. Okay, anyways, we are going down to, and there's 3 because the trace state could be playing, pause, or, you know, not playing. Otherwise, even though pause and playing have the same pause and not playing have the same icons, it's easier to do like that. And I don't use it here in this example because I'm not creating a music player here. Now we keep going down. You'll see that I have a command here. Okay, we'll skip all that extra stuff. Okay, now we'll get to the actual difficult part. So I read a lot of the documentation and I've documented the code with documentation links. So that's kind of, I guess I didn't comment the code, I just documented it. And it's really hard to read because of Rust Analyzer. So I'll just explain it to you. I've created a new tray over here, or tray menu, and I named it English menu because it's in English. And all you have to do is system tray menu and new. Then you want to add some of your stuff. So if you want to add a submenu, you can do add submenu. If you want to add an item, you do add item. And if you're to add an item, you could either do custom menu item for all these strings, or you could do a native item for a separator or anything in the system tray menu, but there's only a separator here, so don't worry about it too much. And to create a submenu, you actually have to use system tray submenu first because it has a title to it. And I believe what they should have done is they should have just like done a system tray menu for both of these that way, and then new takes in an optional string parameter like a root, actually not an optional, a mandatory one like a root or something. It doesn't really matter. And I guess this is a bit cleaner, but look how much redundant stuff there is, so it's not worth that much. Anyways, like what I do is I do root, right? I do system tray menu root. Like that's what I do if I was designing the API for Tauri, but let's not inject my opinions into here because that's kind of not a good thing to do. And anyways, I've created a submenu, and a submenu takes in a menu like before, and the menu acts the same way, so it's recursive, so don't worry about it. Now, an item takes in an ID as well as a title. So the ID is fixed basically for an item, but the title can be changed. But the other thing is that the title cannot be like, you don't know what the title is in a dynamic form. You can't get the title yet in the API, so that's kind of annoying. So you have to use a state, as I said before, which is kind of why I was using a state. We'll get to states right after this. And after you've created a menu, let's create the system tray, which is system tray new with menu. And there's actually IDs, so you could create multiple trays, which is useful in very specific situations that I cannot come up with at the moment, so let's not delve into that. But I've created it with an ID just because maybe you want to try something. Remember when I said you want to maybe have dynamic translations for the tray? What if you could just create the trays for all the languages? That'd be really nice, wouldn't it? So I don't know how that would work though, because what Windows does is it remembers how a tray is put in the tray, how an icon is put in the tray. So if you're creating new icons, would they behave the same as the original one? Who knows, right? So that's kind of what the downside is, but it is another method if you want to, use memory to take care of the translations instead of dynamically translating everything, which would be, or dynamically creating the system tray menu. Like this should be a function in my opinion. I just haven't done it yet because I'm not that smart. Just kidding, I am smart. It's just too lazy to do it right now. I've coded a lot today just to get to this point for you guys. So anyways, we have the system tray, we just add it. And now let's handle the system tray. So to handle the system tray, we just do on system tray handle, and then it takes in an app and an event. And we want to match the event to system tray events. So we'll get menu item click, left click, right click, double click. I don't suggest using double click for anything because if you look at it, you get a left click, a double click, and a left click. So it's not really worth implementing unless you're doing nothing with the left click, which makes no sense either way. So yeah. But anyways, let me just fix that. So I've decided to adopt the events should have a minus sign to specify separators. I think this is a good way because it keeps events and functions separate. So you can't do things that would be arbitrary. So it's not as vague, I guess you could say. And the first thing I do is I get the main window. I get a main window instance if you want to do stuff with the main window. So as you saw here, I could hide the window and show the window. And that's kind of why I did that like that. Instead of having the main window down here, you could use the same variable for any of the events. I also needed to emit the event that occurred, so that's why I defined that main window up there, but let's skip over. Then the next thing I did is I get the item handle for the ID. So when there's a system tray menu item click, the payload or something, the payload basically has the event basically has an ID, which is the menu item ID. It also has a tray ID, so you have to keep that in mind, that this is the system tray event for all trays and not just one. So just keep that in mind when in the rare case that you are having multiple trays, just keep that in mind. I don't recommend having multiple trays for the same thing. So what else can I say? Oh yeah, so then there's the main, we actually want to match the ID. So to match the ID, it's basically like this, and you do quit toggle tray icon and other stuff. So the most complicated thing I did here, which I spend a bunch of time on, is the toggling of the icon. How do you like toggle the icon from or maintain a state in the Rust backend? So that's what the second half of this video is going to be, on how to take care of a state in the backend in Tauri. And for the first thing you want to do is check on, do you want a state that can't be mutated, or do you want a state that can be mutated? And yeah, the state's probably going to be something that can be mutated. If it's not going to be mutated, then you just have to use the read only. But if it's mutated, you can use either a mutex or a read write lock. So to use state, first create an enum or a struct, as I've already done. And then you want to go down here to setup. And the setup code, you just do app.manage. And then you want to create a type of the state. So how states work for like anything in Rust is that any Rust libraries is that there's a state for, there's a max one type state. So there's a, oh my God, it's so hard to say. There's a, for each type or each different type, there can only be one state max of it. Okay. And one state max meaning 0 could be a possibility. So you create a state over here with initial of not playing, and that's the same as the icon over here, which is the icon path that I've assumed. And in our code, we basically say, okay, the user wants to toggle the icon. Let's get the mutex first. So we get the app state, and we specify which state we want, which is the mutex of the trace state. And because it's a mutex, you can't just treat it as the value. And that's why you actually have to do this double 2 lines for the same thing. Because if this goes out of scope or expires basically, then the code doesn't work. So that's why you have to keep this in scope until the end. And so we also need to get the guard of the mutex, because we want to read it as well as mutate it. So I've gotten a mutatable value of trace state, and then we want to match trace state to the different types it could be. So to use match in Rust, you could either specify each of them like this, or if you only want to care about one of these values, you could use the underscore to ignore all the other values, okay? So we said, okay, if it's not playing, we want to get the tray handle, and then we want to set the icon to this icon over here. Now, include bytes is a macro that is, I don't think this is from Tauri itself, it's like a core macro, which takes in a file and converts it to bytes. So this means that you could have files in your directory, and what'll occur is that when you compile, the contents of those files will be embedded into the binary, which is probably how Rust can do single file applications. So I think in my Rocket tutorials, I know it's irrelevant, but in my Rocket tutorials, when I do templates and everything, it'll be interesting to see these apps that are basically having all these static files all in one. It would be pretty cool, in my opinion. So include bytes over here of the ICO. And since it's a raw icon, you want to ensure that it is an ICO file. I'm suggesting an ICO file because ICO file will contain all the different sizes that you need compared to PNG. Like a 72 by 72 won't actually work. There'll be errors. And then we just want to unwrap it when we set the icon, and then we just want to update the state to playing. And at the end over here, at the end of the block, the trace state will go out of scope and the mutex will drop. That means that we forfeit control of it and everything works asynchronously. Okay, so let's look really quickly on the front end now, because now we've emitted it to the front end, but how do we make sure that with something like a framework that things are actually going to work? Like how can we ensure that there will only be one click, or how do we even like figure this out? How do we take care of events? So far, what we've done in the Tauri is that we've used these plugin APIs to take care of it, but you need to understand that what the plugins do is they do this event stuff and they take care of it. What also needs to be remembered is how do you do it in the context of React? If you want to wait for an event, how do you take care of that? So let's see here. How do we process a Rust event? Well, first we want to, listen to that event. Before we were doing check update and we do it, but in the debug menu, the code runs twice, right? So before we get 2 notifications because it was in debug mode, but I've actually solved this issue without removing React's debug mode, and I'll get into that right now. So the first thing you want to do is have a mount ID and set it to null. Second thing you want to do is have a variable of useref again. I'm not sure if it matters if it's a useref or a... Oh, it actually does matter. So it does. I know someone was not really complaining, but they were giving feedback on that. I'll ignore that. But anyways, we want to have a variable here called onListens, which will just have a mapping of mount IDs to onListening functions. And now we want to start our use effect that will run only once on mount. So we get the mount ID, which is basically a random like integer, and we set the current mount ID to this mount ID. And if you're running in Tauri, this is from before, so ignore that. So here's a system tray handling. So we wait for the system tray events, and to do this, to process them, we do payload and event object. So event object can have other stuff part of the event. It's not really, it's it's really nice that VS Code has this, but there you go. This is what it has here. So you can, if you need to use this information, you can just move it from event object to out here. And anyways, we want to do, the first thing is checking if we are in a redundant mount. So in React, in the development mode, in strict mode, it mounts the component twice. So we need to check for if the component was mounted a second time. And to do this, we just check if the mount current does not equal this mount ID. This mount ID was created at the start of the use effect. So if mount ID.current is not the same as our ID, that means something is, that means we shouldn't run any code and we should just drop the listen. So that's what I've done here. Otherwise, we are good to process. So then you just test it out and comment. I'll have this code commented, but I have this so that you could see that it's working. And lastly, the Tauri event.listen returns a onListen function. But since this is an asynchronous function and we're in a synchronous use effect, you could either have all of this under the async hack, or you could just use .thens. I've decided to use .thens. So we do Tauri event and then .then. We take that onListen command and we add it to our onListens mapping. So we got onListens.current and then we add this mount ID to it. And that means that this will probably run. And if it won't run, if this fails, then your app will still run, and the next time it tries processing, it'll work. So it doesn't matter if in that extremely rare situation when you're developing, you run a event just between the amounts. Like it's not even a valid edge case. And lastly, we want to return a function which resets the mount ID. So when the component gets dismounted, we set the mount ID to null, meaning that if this event ever fired, the app won't do anything. And if the app gets remounted, then this code runs again and it's set to a different ID basically. Like math.random is extremely long. The chance of it hitting like the same thing is probably less than the chance of winning the lottery. Don't quote me on that, but that's basically what I'm thinking of it. And that is it for the video, actually. I think I explained a lot. But yeah, we're almost done with this series. I hope in the future I actually improve the system tray so that it can be international, compatible with different languages. But I'll do that in next year sometime when I am making a crazy app that'll benefit the crypto Monero community a lot. But anyways, that is it. There's couple more things I want to make videos on in Tauri, and then you guys should be good with everything anyways. So yeah, I hope this video was useful, because this video I was trying to look for it at the very beginning in January of this year, and this video kind of shows you a demo and how to code it. So I'll see you in the next one.